Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss therapeutic modalities and concepts that seem to be especially relevant and potent when combined with psychedelic tools. We discuss common factors among the varied approaches to psychotherapy, some of our favorite therapeutic tools, psychological flexibility versus inflexibility, adaptive and maladaptive patterns, transference and countertransference, mindfulness, corrective emotional experiences, human development, trauma and exposure therapies, and much, much more. A couple of announcements for you before we get to the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training and use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. We discuss a little bit in the show our work with clinical trials. If you or anyone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial here with Numinus, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. At the beginning of the episode today, we read some emails and comments from some of you listeners. If you'd like to support the show, you can always leave a comment, send us an email, or leave us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Without further ado, here's our discussion today about therapies that pair well with psychedelics. We're back with another episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. How you doing, Reid?
Very well, Steve. How are you today?
I'm doing great. We're meeting virtually today. We don't have a super long episode for you today, folks, but we just want to highlight a few things we think might be especially useful for those of you who are interested in or are engaged in the psychedelic-assisted therapy process, either as a practitioner or as a client. We wanted to talk a bit about some of the therapeutic concepts we think pair well with psychedelic-assisted therapy, but also just pair well with life. So hopefully give you some good takeaways. We thought it might be fun to start. We haven't really done this a whole lot, but with a few messages from you folks, from our dear listeners. We get emails and we get reviews and sometimes comments on the YouTube version of the podcast that are super fun for us to read. But we got an email from a guy named John who has been corresponding with a little bit lately, who's given us some pretty interesting feedback and some fun ideas. He listened to our last episode about shame. And if any of you listen to that episode, Reid and I kind of began with sort of just some semantics, distinguishing between shame and guilt. And John had a way to distinguish between shame and guilt that I thought was actually pretty useful. So I thought I'd read a portion of his email here. So he says, listening to the podcast on shame, great content, acknowledges that sometimes he can obsess over semantics, perhaps even more than Reid.
Whoa, more than me?
No, it's a semantic competition.
I like semantics.
Of course. He says, one pretty simple distinction that I've found helpful is to separate guilt from shame by defining guilt as an emotion and shame as a belief in one's badness or worthlessness. Then you don't need to worry as much about the qualifiers like toxic or internalized or healthy or unhealthy. Guilt is healthy like any other emotion until it's overwhelming, at which point it becomes traumatic guilt. Chronic guilt, especially traumatic guilt, eventually produces a belief that we call shame. So in that sense, shame is bad or unhelpful or maladaptive. He says, I know it's semantic, but it kind of cuts down on extra words. So I don't know. What do you think, Reid, about that particular distinction?
I like it. Thank you, John. Yeah. I think that's summed up very well what we were like meandering around and debating a little bit in semantic territory. But that's a good way to conceptualize it.
Yeah. Thanks for the parsimony, John. Here's another one. This was a comment on one of our YouTube videos. And I just thought this one made me blush. And it was kind of fun to read for the rest of you. This is from Penny. I've been binge listening to your podcast for the past 6 months. I go to bed with you almost every night. It's almost indecent. That was the part that made me chuckle. It hits the proverbial nail on the head. I love you guys. Always so informative, illuminating, and fun too. I'm on my own psychedelic journey with Numinus, and you're both such a valuable resource. Well, thank you, Penny.
Aw. Yeah, thanks, Penny.
It's
And
so
that's pretty
gratifying.
funny too.
Yeah, funny. But it's gratifying to hear from you folks, either when you write reviews and, places like Apple Podcasts, and or you send us messages. And, we appreciate it all. We appreciate the thoughtful criticisms, the invitations, the feedback, and the occasional praise. I'm a sucker for praise. So I will say that John also mentioned that he is enrolled in our Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy course. I think the March cohort that's coming up. So I know I mentioned that in the intros, but if any of you are interested in good training, check out the link in the show notes or go to our Numinus website and see what we have to offer.
Cool. Steve's lead instructor for those things. And I join in now and then. I think I have a couple lectures or sessions with you this next round. But
yeah, both the fundamentals course and then our applied one. That's the one that typically comes next if you follow the Numinus training certification pipeline, the applied psychedelic assisted therapy, where we go into more detail about particular applications and indications and medicines. So
cool. Yeah. And mostly I'm tied up in our research clinic these days. Like part of the busy week this week is we just had a psychedelic dosing session in clinic, which is always a really neat thing to hold space for, be a part of. In this case, it's our 5-MeO DMT study. We have a psilocybin study going on and lots of others. If you want to check them out, cedarclinicalresearch.com or numinus.com and see what we're up to. Especially if you're in Utah, you can just check it out and see if one is of interest to you or anyone you know.
Yeah, it's a cool resource, and just feel really grateful that I get to participate in clinical trials. It's fun. You get a lot of good training, but also, like you said, being able to sit with folks on a medicine is sometimes a rare and beautiful experience. So,
yeah, it is. It is. Well, shall we talk about psychotherapy? Maybe first of all, from a bird's eye view of what the heck is psychotherapy, or what are some of the common threads across the alphabet soup of therapy acronyms?
yeah, I was writing down all the different, acronyms of either therapeutic modalities that I've been trained in or I like to draw from. I consider myself fairly eclectic. You know, sort of, I do my work informed by general principles than an adherence to a particular therapeutic modality necessarily. But I remember being in grad school in clinical psychology, and we read a book by, I think, Bruce Wampold called The Great Psychotherapy Debate. And I'm sure the data has been updated, but one of the main sort of premises of the book is that sometimes therapists can get a little preoccupied by the particular interventions. And what the psychotherapy outcome research suggests is that most of what we can attribute positive outcomes to are actually factors that are fairly common among the different therapeutic approaches. And they are called common factors in the research literature. So these are things like the therapeutic alliance, compassion, empathy, non-judgmental listening, positive regard. There's an aspect of the therapeutic alliance called the working alliance. So meaning, are you and your client aligned on why they are there, right? Do you both have a good sense of what the goals are? And then are the tasks that you are, or are the processes, are what you are engaged in the therapy room, do they seem connected to achieving those goals or addressing those particular issues? And then, of course, being aligned on the expectations. What can I hope to experience? What can I hope to change? What can I hope to heal as a result of participating in this particular therapy? So regardless of the acronym that you adhere to, the kind of therapeutic approach you use, these factors are fairly common across those therapeutic approaches and are important, really important.
Yeah, because there are a lot of therapeutic approaches, right? From CBT to DBT, ACT, EFT, IFS, EMDR, etc. If etc. is one of them, I don't even know.
Probably
But
ECT.
I like your why question, though. Like, I like to back up and think about that. Why are we doing this? What are we treating with quotes, or what's the goal of psychotherapy in general? And you could slice that up a lot of different ways. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Steve. But for me, it keeps coming back to this idea of entrenched maladaptive patterns, like patterns of behavior are responses to triggers or stuff or life that get us in trouble, aka they're maladaptive. And entrenched is just a way to say that they're sticky, like patterns are in humans. As patterns, they likely recur. And so, wonder what you think of that, Steve, and how do words spoken in a therapy session and the interpersonal relationship with all those common factors you mentioned bring about change?
Yeah, I'll start by saying I do like the distinction between what is adaptive and what is not adaptive, or adaptive and maladaptive. And that's often the way we also diagnose so-called mental illnesses or mental health concerns, is by looking at a particular constellation of patterns. Like you said, either patterns of thinking, patterns of behaving, patterns of experiencing and feeling, and assessing for whether or not those patterns result in dysfunction or maladaptation in a major life area, right? This could be with your interpersonal life, or let's say you're a student, your ability to accomplish your goals with respect to education or your occupational life. Or do those patterns result in damage to you physically? Do they diminish your physical health, or just cause abject, unnecessary psychological suffering? So I do like that distinction. And then the entrenchment, it makes me think of this concept of psychological flexibility versus inflexibility that you'll find in a lot of different therapeutic approaches, but especially ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. At least in graduate school, that's where I first encountered this concept of psychological flexibility or inflexibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's a pretty helpful framework too.
Yeah, and as an aside, perhaps a relevant one is that Yale put out a manual for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy a while back. This is a few years ago, publicly available. You could still search and download it, but that was based on ACT. So that is one that people are pairing with psychedelic therapy. Perhaps not the most common one you hear about, but definitely a widely used and very solid, useful therapy tool. But
Yep.
So where do these entrenched patterns come from, like the maladaptive ones? And we've said, Steve, many a time on here, this therapy adage: if it's hysterical, it's historical. And I like that. It's just so telling. Meaning, if your reaction is out of proportion to the trigger of the situation at hand, maybe it stems from something in your past, which I guess the technical term would be causal misattributions from childhood or something like that, or from any time in your life, not just traumas, but adversities, stress, any event that occurred in front of your eyes that is carried on in your semantic memory, if you will.
Right. Yeah, and the sort of somatic experiencing and nervous system programming folks might also say that it's a learning issue, but it's also an imprinting issue. So, in your early childhood environment, if you have some experiences that one might call traumatic, or like you said, it maybe not traumatic in the sense that you meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but it imprinted on you a particular pattern of responding to perceived threats. And then you age through your developmental stages and you hang on to certain ways of reacting to those perceived threats that then no longer serve you. We might say that is one of the ways in which it is historical, right? That you learned something early on. It can also be historical in the sense of inherited genetics. We've talked a lot about sort of the nature-nurture influences and or what's sometimes called the diathesis stress model of psychopathology, where you might have a predisposition loaded by your genetics, and then you have an experience that unlocks that predisposition and creates a trait.
Yeah. I also love the saying, also on the side, but altered states for altered traits. So you go into a psychedelic experience that kind of heats up these rigid structures, if you will, to use the rebus analogy from Carhart Harris and Imperial College. But and then they become more malleable. But this imprinting concept, it's funny, every time I hear the word imprinting, I think about Twilight. Is that just
I thought you were going to say Lorenz and his geese, but yeah, okay.
Yeah. And then I think about the geese, because I think it was when we were chatting with Gul Dolan, a fun chat, a past episode. If anyone hasn't heard it, go look that up, because we were talking about this neuroplasticity and critical period concept. But I think on there I was throwing in a fun story from the past. When it was in the 60s, Tim Leary got up, and I heard this talk on Spotify where he was talking about the idea of psychological imprinting, like the programming that occurs in a critical period after you're born, when your nervous system is so open, like you're a rapid learning machine. And that, depending on the species, may last for hours, days, longer, and results in this lasting conditioning. And in that talk, Tim Leary described the geese, or a specific experiment involving ducklings that were shown this moving orange basketball instead of a mother duck at birth. And wherever the basketball rolled along the floor, the ducks followed. And when the critical period was over, researchers gave the opportunity to go interact with their live mother duck, but they ignored her and followed the basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it's a not that we are ducklings or geese, but it's a testament to how there are these sort of critical periods for imprinting in the development of a mammalian, or in this case, bird's central nervous system, and why we think, according to at least Gul Dolan's preliminary research, that psychedelics can be so impactful for change, because they might reopen some of these, especially social reward learning critical windows.
Yeah, and it's kind of neat, for all his faults as well, and perhaps overzealousness. Tim Leary was onto something back then. I think in that same talk, was talking about how the brain is like a camera with billions of lenses, and that's continuously processing this information. And we do know that 95% plus of that processing is happening beneath the surface of our conscious awareness. And he was suggesting psychedelics as a tool to kind of reverse or reshape some of this imprinting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting explanation for what I observe in my psychedelic therapy clients, right? I've had some clients that I've met with for regular therapy for a long time. And let's say after, lots of inquiry and awareness generating, they've got pretty good insight as to why, or I should say, as to the nature of some of those self-defeating entrenched patterns that you started the conversation describing. They got insight into the existence of those patterns. But in spite of that insight, they don't feel differently, right? Like, yes, I know that I am technically lovable. I can even find evidence in my life of people who love me, but I still feel terrible. I still have these shame beliefs, or I still don't like myself. And then, we'll prepare and cultivate a good intention for a psychedelic therapy session. And in that session, because of the changes that are made to the mind, they experience real, embodied, lived, and believed connection to an alternative belief, right? A different perspective. Like, oh, I actually feel what it feels like to know that I am lovable, not just like have a hypothesis, but like know it and to feel it. And even though that altered state doesn't last forever, that's where we, in the integration process, can leverage that experience and reference it and create a trail of breadcrumbs, and so that we can return to it, so that we can then hopefully create an altered state. And I've seen that. Time and time again. It's one of the reasons why, I've decided to bend my career in the direction of psychedelics. I just think they're such a powerful tool to that end.
Yeah, and a tool, because you can you can get this altered state in psychotherapy a number of different ways, and in life, of course. But I think what I wanted to highlight, what you're describing in the experience, sounds like this idea that we talk about fairly often of corrective emotional experiences. It dates back like to the 40s. I think it was Alexander and French, and used a lot in emotion focused therapy and others, like across all these therapy modalities. But when a client gets in a situation where they're expecting a certain negative response, in this case from their therapist, like they're afraid to say it, but they're going to say something that they carry a lot of shame around. And they fear, understandably, because it's happened in the past, that they're going to be judged or kicked out of the therapy room. And this is the golden opportunity for the therapist to kind of reshape that narrative, for extinction of the pattern and reconsolidation. And one of the core tenets of change, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you implied or stated, it's, I think that corrective emotional experience and its utility is pretty common regardless of the particular therapeutic approach that you use. Maybe the path to it is different if you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy versus emotion focused therapy, or even something more experiential like EMDR or somatic experiencing, or IFS for that matter. If there's an
Mm-hmm.
inquiry process, and then like you said, their expectations of how you as the therapist is going to react, um, aren't met. Instead, they're pleasantly not met, right? They get a different kind of reaction that can provide an update, an opportunity for sort of a psychological software update. I'm getting different data here.
Yeah. And beyond that, I think this idea of an altered state of consciousness in the therapy room, even in little small ways throughout the session, in the absence of psychedelics, um, are also opportunities for change. And like, I think it also, well, it reminds me of Hakomi. I did some training in Hakomi therapy where um, it struck me really early on the parallels between Hakomi and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, because in the Hakomi method, you create this safe and healing relationship at first. Like, you spend lots of time to establish a relationship of trust and sense of safety, and encourage gently, compassionately the client to tune in, be mindful, be sensitive to their experience. And then whether it's just through the passage of time in the session or through gentle prompts, you evoke experiences and then you process them. And psychedelics also do that, like evoke an experience, or therapy sessions of a lot of different kinds. Like, you could look at EMDR this way, or parts perspective, especially if you're in an embodied state and tuning into that experience and not just thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think for a lot of these therapies, and like you said, in particular with psychedelic assisted therapy, there's a lot of value in evoking an experience in a safe container, almost as like a laboratory or a dojo, or we're going to sort of bring up what happens in sort of real life, but we're doing it in a more contained, safe way to provide you with resources and skills and support so that you can work through it. That's harder to do in your everyday life, especially if you feel isolated or under resourced.
Yeah. And if you look at it from a like a neuroscience perspective, it's like when these patterns in your neural networks get activated and there's new information, like, uh-oh, cannot compute. I was expecting a shameful response, but I got one that's compassionate and loving. There's new information. There's essentially a prediction error. And so for a period of time from that moment, this new information can be used to reprogram your neural networks and essentially start to change the pattern. Like, and the more vivid and embodied, the more powerful, the more potential there is for lasting change. It ties into this idea I know that we talk about a lot, Steve, of cognitive dissonance, that inconsistency among our internal beliefs that leads to a tension or dissonance. And the brain's got to do something with that to restore harmony.
Yeah, and we don't want to fault the brain for doing what it often does in the face of that dissonance, and that is to return to the familiar. Even if the familiar is one of those entrenched maladaptive beliefs, kind of the devil that you know is better than the devil that you don't, as the saying goes. So you'll see this, and it's almost been memed in popular culture. You have the person who they keep dating the same kind of toxic person who does them wrong, but it's because they are familiar with that kind of person, or maybe that person for them is sort of a representation of one of their parents with whom they never really resolved dissonance, with. So we can recapitulate these self-defeating relationship patterns for a lot of different reasons, of course. But because it's to update that belief with new data and to change it is almost more difficult, or sometimes it is more difficult than to simply hold fast to the old belief, even if the old belief is also harmful.
Yeah, I like that. And what's coming to mind for me is like a little example, a couple examples actually. And I think these fall under the realm of transference and countertransference that, we may want to dissect for a moment. But if you think about kids, as when we're children, we have a different way of approaching life and solving problems. We're born dependent on our parents, and we turn to them over and over to solve problems, like cry for food and diaper changes and things. And so even as we're growing up, even for many people, and probably all of us in some ways, we turn to others for answers or solving our problems. And that shows up in the therapy room. Like we as therapist guides often end up being the grown-ups and asked to solve problems, and there's a temptation there to jump in and do it. But this is just a reminder to be on the lookout for in you, like a feeling that the client is waiting for you to do or solve something, because it can also be powerful to let them do that themselves.
Right. Yeah, this concept of transference and countertransference, I think at this point I would argue is a universal concept that should be well understood by all therapists, regardless of what particular therapeutic approach you use. Even though it was, coined in the late 1800s by Freud and is, very much a part of, of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic approaches. But generally speaking, is the idea that we, let's say in terms of the client and transference, the client transfers onto you as the therapist a relationship attitude that they might have had with somebody else in their life, like let's say their parent. So all of a sudden they're transferring onto you some emotional energy or relating pattern that you didn't earn, in the sense that it's not a reaction to you in particular, but it's more of an sort of a projection of the way they felt about, let's say, their father. And that's a wonderful opportunity to resolve some dissonance, kind of like we were talking about before, because here you don't react in the way that maybe their father did, and it provides a corrective emotional experience. And then countertransference would be just it going the other direction, where you as a therapist are transferring some of your own stuff onto your client.
Yeah, and it's pretty important, especially for those coming into this without a formal psychotherapy background. Pretty important, extremely, in my opinion, to be aware of that, and just to remember yourself and your emotions and your attunement to the situation as a tool in the therapy session, big time.
Yeah, especially with psychedelic-assisted therapy. We go over this a lot in our training programs, but if you're going to be using psychedelic tools, you're going to be sitting with people who experience pretty intense ups and downs, sometimes emotional states that you don't always see in the regular therapy room. So you're going to have to get familiar with your own triggers to that respect. And a lot of people who are interested in the helping professions want people to feel good, right? We want people to be well. And so some of us can get a little uncomfortable when somebody, at least in the moment, appears to not be well. And if we're rushing to resolve their emotional distress because we are uncomfortable with that distress, that might be some countertransference, right? I'm the
Mhm.
helper, I'm the peacemaker, and so I need to help and make peace with this person. Again, not necessarily because it's what they need. Maybe they need to go in and through. Maybe they need to have space held for that intense emotion. But instead, it's because it's what I need. I can't handle them being really, really sad right now, or I can't handle them being really, really angry right now.
Yeah, couple examples of each, just because I find those useful. Just even the terms transference and countertransference can get kind of discombobulated in one's brain sometimes. But transference examples, like a client placing unrealistic demands on you, a client being so complimentary, admiring you, telling you how much they remind you of someone dear to them, or perhaps a client unfairly placing anger on you when talking about some difficult relationships they've had, or an abusive parent, for example. But then on the flip side, your counter transference, you'd look at things like you when you might offer advice versus listening and letting someone figure it out, or when you're tempted to just overshare and use it to share your own stuff, or anything along those boundaries lines too, probably can often represent a countertransference example.
Right. Yeah. So you don't need to be a psychoanalyst to at least understand these
Yeah.
concepts and appreciate them and track them in your work as a therapist.
Do you, Steve, use like Pavlov stuff in therapy? I'm just thinking of everyone's first introduction to psychology 101, if you've taken that class in college or even high school. um, ring a bell and make a dog salivate, for example. Wondering how you weave that in.
It's funny you ask. I had a client today. We were talking about um, how to change his emotional reaction when he is presented with a task he doesn't want to do. So let's
Mm-hmm.
say dishes. He does want the outcome. He wants a clean home environment because he recognizes that calms his nervous system and makes him feel proud to have a clean home environment. But he hates doing the dishes for some really good reasons. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the dishes. So we were
Mm-hmm.
coming up with strategies to help change that sort of relationship to dish doing. And one of the things we came up with was, to reserve a certain audiobook that he's into, that he will only listen while doing the dishes. And so I was talking to him about this, and he's saying, "Are you telling me to like Pavlov my dishes?" So he actually used that word, and I was like, "Well, yeah, we're using basic learning principles, either classical or operant conditioning, because yeah, they work on dogs, but they and mice and pigeons and things like that. But we have nervous systems too that have dopamine and are sensitive to reward and punishment. So yeah, we can leverage those things too."
Yeah, it makes me think of like combat veterans and PTSD. You might startle every time you hear a loud noise,
Mhm.
but if that gets reactivated in a safe and supported place, kind of to tie in this corrective experience concept, then your cortex learns, and over each time you're reshaping this in that setting, that the war's over, you don't need that startle, everything's okay. Sending these inhibitory signals to other parts of your brain, like through the midbrain, blocking the fear response in your amygdala, even though it's still going to detect a threat or a sound, but not respond in that historical way, if you will.
Right. And I think bringing up trauma and PTSD in this context is spot on, because a lot of the therapies that are used to address trauma, at least the symptoms that you described, are sort of learning theory based, meaning even like prolonged exposure, which is a therapy approach that encourages in a supportive environment clients to write out a narrative of their index trauma that they would normally avoid, right? They don't want to think about it. They don't want to feel the associated feelings, and then to gradually get to a place where they are, through, like as the name implies, um, exposing themselves to that story over and over and over again, and trying to edit the thoughts associated with that story. And eventually, through that exposure, it kind of extinguishes, again, to use another learning theory term, the learned response, that exaggerated startle response or the avoidance response. And interestingly, when I talked to Jonathan Robinson about his MDMA practice, he said that he used prolonged exposure with MDMA and found that because of the way an MDMA sort of quiets that fight or flight response and quiets the amygdala, that it was particularly effective. When I used to do prolonged exposure when I was in the Air Force, it's a therapy that's powerful but has a really high dropout rate because, I mean, as I just described it, it can feel pretty intense for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And I've been thinking about this lately in terms of psychedelic prep and intention setting, and how we understandably often gravitate towards the positive values and emotional states and ideals to plant as a seed going into the session. Like, it makes sense and is quite useful, but I think we sometimes shy away from too much some of the difficult things before a session because of this idea of like amplifying what's in your psyche when you go into a session. But if you do have that therapeutic relationship and those space holding skills and a really safe and supportive setting, then there's also an argument to be made about like tilling the soil and stirring things up that might be difficult from the past if one is ready to work on it. I know this can be controversial territory and perhaps nuanced and hard to describe, but I've seen from the literature, the older literature, even there's a ketamine paper for addiction where in Europe these researchers, like decades ago, or at least a decade ago, they would give a high dose of IM ketamine and mid-session introduce the smell of alcohol to people with alcohol dependence and some other things to work on that from somewhat of an exposure approach.
Yeah. I think, we're not stirring the sediment or tilling the soil aimlessly or recklessly or haphazardly. So when it happens in the context of what I described at the beginning of the show, like this positive working alliance where the client has an understanding of why this is happening. And then, like you described, it's happening in the context of this safe environment with this safe relationship where there's trust. And also they've been given resources. That's another thing we talk a lot about in our courses. We teach a particular kind of approach called embodied inquiry, where we help people informed by somatic experiencing really tune in and examine an experience of a trigger through all the different facets of experience, sensations, images, memories, beliefs, all those things. And so they do that, and then we help coach them into discovering and elaborating a resource. And this could be their breath. This could be a progressive muscle relaxation. It could be a happy place, right, that they go to in their mind. So again, it's probably different than just raw exposure that you might use with like a phobia of heights. It's exposure to context, right?
Yeah. It's a good example because, like you mentioned in somatic experiencing, one of Peter Levine's tools called pendulation is to touch into the difficulty, go back to happy, safe, calming place. And that nervous system emotional workout, if you will, is quite useful for learning to self-regulate in day-to-day life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, pain in context matters. If all of a sudden you felt intense burning in your, let's say your pec muscles, right, your chest, you'd be like, oh no, I need to go to the hospital. But if you were feeling that intense burning after doing lots of push-ups, even if it's the exact same physiological process, same sensation, you might actually enjoy it, right? Because it represents gains, right? You're getting stronger, you're getting buffer.
Yeah. And you brought up emotions as well in your client example, and I'll try not to get too excited because I love emotion science and emotion focused therapy. But just to mention one thing I've been working on personally lately is this practice of not only scanning and identifying and differentiating emotions more consciously as they come up, but also trying to identify if there's a clear memory attached to these and what it is. Because like that saying, I think, therefore I am, I think it's almost more accurate to say I feel, therefore I am. Like I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions. But they are damn good signals that give us information about how to navigate life.
Yeah, they are not to be ignored. What you said made me think of mindfulness. As long as we're talking about fairly universal principles that are effective in therapy and in life, being able to recognize that you are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, that you are some kind of infinite conscious container within which thoughts and feelings emerge, can help do what they say in ACT, which is to defuse with our beliefs, defuse with our experience. ACT talks about this continuum of psychological flexibility and inflexibility, and that we become inflexible when we are fused with some of these things. And we think, I am stupid, instead of I'm having the thought that I'm stupid. And there's lots of fun exercises in ACT. I remember watching Steve Hayes, the creator of the therapy, demonstrate. I forget exactly what it's called, but he will have clients imagine their self-critic, like their self-critical thoughts, as if it was in the voice of like their favorite cartoon character. And he would encourage them to actually say their self-critical thoughts out loud in the voice of that cartoon character. And I think he would do this just to like show off that he could do a good Donald Duck impression, because I think that's usually what he would do. But it helps you defuse. It helps you get a little bit of distance from it.
I can do a Donald Duck impression. I won't right now, but because I don't know how it would really come out on the spot. But
yeah, alarming.
I'm glad you brought up mindfulness, though, because I think we were talking about how we all go about our day-to-day lives with these unconscious beliefs having an impact, and we often don't have an awareness of their influence. But mindfulness is the tool we use to bring it to light. Mindfulness lets your inner healer create change through gentle awareness rather than brute force. And mindfulness, aka awareness, I believe is the greatest agent for change.
I agree. And there's a component to mindfulness that is also highlighted in ACT that I think is especially helpful in psychedelic-assisted therapy. Maybe it's one of the reasons the Yale project used ACT, but is this concept of willingness. Willingness to experience whatever is emerging in the field of experience.
Surrender.
Yeah, right? Like we've often said on the show, what you resist persists, and that a lot of times what contributes to a so-called bad trip on psychedelics is our insistence that we not be experiencing what we're experiencing in that moment, wanting to control it or change it. So in ACT, they talk about turning up the dial of willingness, that it's not a switch, it's on a continuum. One way to move through a very difficult experience, whether on psychedelics or not, is just to turn up that dial of willingness. I'm willing to feel uncomfortable right now. I'm willing to feel sad. I'm willing to feel upset.
I love that. Because I think I was sharing with you before we started recording, Steve, about some recent triggers I have. And it's a good, like things that come up and we might be annoyed by that, we have to feel annoyed. But, I'm just reminding myself right now, because, this episode is already useful for me, is mindfulness is noticing how one's being touched and moved and allowing it and with love and compassion, and then working with that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Reid. And like you said, that love and compassion is a non-judgmental stance. And I find that even now, after doing this for a living and doing a lot of my own personal growth and healing, that is still a challenge for me. It's still a challenge for me to have that dial of willingness turned up, and to not allow my inner critic or judge to come in and say, you shouldn't be feeling this way, or this is silly, this is dumb, or I don't want to be feeling this way, I want to fix it, I want to change it. So it is a challenge, but there's so much fruit to be harvested on the other end of that labor.
Yeah. It Yeah, mindfulness is a great way to look at this because, it's a way to get in touch with our deepest feelings, attitudes, and somehow through this work, letting them be, letting them show, and tuning into them. And because we're humans on this planet, bumping into other humans, at least for me, that's where most of the triggers seem to come from. Like, if I get annoyed, it usually has something to do with some other human out there if I trace it back. But then this, you mentioned positive regard, like that unconditional worthy goal of positive regard. And positive regard you can try on in lots of ways, I think implies getting beyond the ego reactions that might be stirred up by the superficial behaviors of someone else, behaviors that we might find triggering, irritating, or in worst cases, frightening, and then finding our way back to this more clear perspective of the person inside those behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I have a client who's struggling with this, sometimes we'll do a little inner child work on behalf of the person that is perturbing them. So,
Mm-hmm.
see them as their 7-year-old self. And most of us, when we do that, it's easier for us to have unconditional positive regard or compassion for a child overreacting or acting out than for our adult self or the adult self of the person that's annoying us. So, think
Yeah.
of them as an innocent child acting out.
Yeah.
And if you want to send some love and compassion to any part of them, send it to that part of them.
Yeah, that's I love that therapy tool trick example. It actually reminds me of A Course in Miracles. If anyone's familiar with that spiritual path, there's one part in that framework that says every criticism is actually a call for love.
Hmm.
And I find that extremely useful, like a radical change in perspective. Oh, that person yelling is just in need of love.
Yeah, hard to remember when you're being cut off in traffic. But I think it's a useful perspective to take for sure. Hard to argue that we can't use more love in society, in our lives, right?
Yep, yep. That's the medicine right there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Reid, I know you have a hard stop here coming up. Anything else? We just sort of did a little sampling of some principles and tools that we like. Talk a little bit about psychedelics.
I would love to just continue talking about this for hours, to be honest. So maybe we could pick up in a part two. I know we say that sometimes, but
Yeah.
because we could dive in on a number of these specifics. I know we've talked about parts work. We've had episodes in the more distant past on EMDR, etc. Um, but yeah, I think this has been a really great big picture perspective on psychotherapy, and look forward to chatting with you more about it.
Yeah, one thing I will say in parting is that we get asked a lot, especially by therapists who are interested in this work, which therapies are going to pair well with psychedelic-assisted therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be an empirical question that we study and test. There are particular kinds of approaches that have found their way into the clinical trials. They tend to be more client-led than more therapist-led and directive. But my hunch is that the term is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that as long as the common factors are present, that certain psychedelic tools are going to enhance almost any therapeutic approach. This is a hunch. I don't know that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that I've been able to use psychedelic tools with my clients and a variety of different therapeutic approaches, it has been a synergistic effect every time. So we'll see.
Yeah, beautiful. And one final thought that I'd like to share is just, when you go into therapy, or you go into any interaction for that matter, like, how would it be if you considered yourself a brother sister soul on this human journey together, who sees and understands their suffering? um, I realize it's not easy to do, but that's such a useful stance to try on.
Yeah, beautiful last words. Thank you, Reid.
Thanks, Steve.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.